A poorly set up bike is unsafe, uncomfortable, and at the very least could just make you and your bike feel absolutely awful out on the trails. But this isn't something you should be doing with just a brand new bike. I'm actually going to be doing these checks on my Eugene after I flew from the UK to here in sunny California. So stick with me and follow my 5 big tips on how to get that set up perfect. First thing that I always check, even if I've previously set up my bike, is my saddle height, because sometimes it can even get knocked or changed in transit. Now, if your saddle height is too low, like this, you can put strain on your knees and your pedal efficiency won't be very good. And if it's too high, then you might overreach for the pedals, overextend your knees and give you knee pain, but it might also cause you to rock your hips over the saddle and give you back pain. So this is definitely a really important one to check. So my favorite place to start with saddle height is to measure my inseam while I'm in my riding shoes, and say that is 79 centimeters or 790 millimeters. Then I will match my pedal to saddle height with that measurement. If you don't have a tape measure where you are, then you can roughly do this on the bike. So if you find something to lean against, then what you want to do is get your heel on that pedal, back pedal until it's at its furthest point. Now, right now, I can feel myself leaning over to get to that pedal, so I know my saddle height is actually too high. What you want to be doing is sat firmly on the saddle, and you should be able to pedal backwards with your heels without rocking. If you are finding that your knees are slightly bent when you backpedal, then chances are your saddle is too low. A common mistake I see being made with setup is not setting the sag on your suspension correctly. And this should be done if you make any changes to your system weight. So for example, a heavier backpack or more padding, for example, will increase your rider weight. So your suspension sag will need to change as well. And also maybe checking that sag before long rides or after it's come out of transit. If your suspension is too firm, you're going to have a pretty rough ride, so that will be uncomfortable, and it may even make you feel quite nervous over rough terrain, and it will be pretty tiresome over a long ride too. If your suspension is too soft, it may even bottom out on jumps and drop-offs or even G-outs, and it will feel pretty disconcerting into corners, and it may be very inefficient as well. So sag is just measuring the percentage movement into your travel. So for example, I've got 140 mils of travel here. So if I wanted 25% sag, which is quite firm, quite efficient, good for XC bikes and trail bikes, then I would want 35 mils of movement, because 140 times 0.25, which is 25%, gives me 35. So if I was to get on my bike and sink into my suspension, those forks should move down 35 mil to have my sag set correctly. So I've just stood on my bike and measured my sag, and it's come up as 23 millimeters on my forks, which I know is less than I wanted, because I wanted more like 35 millimeters. So if it's less, that means that these forks are too firm. Now that makes sense, because I'm wearing a lot less clothes than I was in the winter of the UK. I'm having a lighter backpack, so I can afford to take some of the air out in order to get that feeling nice and plush, and just how I had it back in the UK. One of the most common setup problems is not setting up your cockpit correctly. So that's your handlebars and your stem. Now, for example, if you were to have handlebars that are too wide, you might find you get shoulder ache, you might find that your bike is hard to steer and maneuver. And for example, having a stem that's maybe too long might leave you feeling stretched out and give you backache, or have too much weight on the front, which makes your bike hard to control. Either way, this is something that will affect your overall bike and your comfort, so it is something you're going to need to experiment with over time. Now, I'm sorry to say that this setup tip isn't a quick fix because it is something you get used to over time, and it may be different for different bikes that you own as well. But what I will say, if you make any changes, then do make sure they are small. They need to be 5 to 10 mil in changes. So 5 mil off each end of the handlebar is a big change. 10 mil on a stem is a big change as well. So if you want to experiment with slight changes without committing to cutting bars or changing components, there are a few things you can do. So for example, if you feel like you want shorter handlebars, can you move your controls and your levers inwards and try and see if that feels better for you out on the trail? If you are thinking about handlebars that need to be higher or lower, can you adjust the stem height or the stack and move some spaces underneath or above it in order to change the height of your front end? All of these things are good places to start to get an idea of what you want. Not having your tyre pressures set up correctly is one of the biggest mistakes made. It's the easiest mistake to make, but also one of the easiest to fix. The problem is, if you were to have overinflated tyres, you may have quite a rough ride, it'll be uncomfortable, you may lose traction, and you may even be skipping over technical terrain as well. Whereas if you have underinflated tyres, it'll be very inefficient, but it'll also feel quite disconcerting in corners, and your bike will be really susceptible to pinch punches as they bottom out on the trail with your rims. Now, there's no hard and fast rule to figuring out what tyre pressure works for you, but once you've found it, you'll know because it feels right on the bike. You'll have good traction, good comfort, all of those things. So check your tyre pressure after you've found the right one for you. Maybe get a tyre pressure gauge to check it, or get a pump with a gauge on it as well. And every time you go out for a bike ride again, try and check your tyre pressures and match what you had before. But of course, this is a bit of a baseline. So for me, for example, I run 19 PSI in my trail bike, and that is a good baseline, but I will increase it sometimes if I go to fast, hard, rough courses, perhaps here in sunnier conditions, and I might drop it a little bit if I'm in slow riding conditions, perhaps wet and soft terrain that is slowing down my riding, but also might need a little bit of extra grip from a lower tyre pressure. Brake setup is easily overlooked, especially if you've already had a perfectly set up bike, but maybe you've put the bike in transit, maybe it's gone on an aeroplane or in your car. You can easily knock the levers or knock the calipers out of line, but you can just as easily fix it with just a multi-tool. Now, if you feel like your levers are out of line, I often notice they're out of line when I rest my hands on the levers, and you'll feel that the brakes kind of fall in a different place along the fingers, especially when you relax like this or when you're out on a trail. Now, the way that I fix this, if I don't have any measuring devices or any fancy tools to make them perfect, is to sit on the bike and move until the lever that I like meets a certain reference point, perhaps on the grip, and then I'll look over to the other one that feels wrong, and usually you'll see that they're in matched, and I'll just adjust that, loosen off the bolt and move it until they look balanced, and that should be enough to match the levers. If your calipers are not aligned, perhaps they've been knocked or moved somehow, you will often hear quite a squeaky noise when you move your bike backwards and forwards, or perhaps they'll be quite noisy on the trail. And also, if you pick up the front end and try and move the tyre, they may stop or roll a little bit and then come to an abrupt stop. Now, what you'll need to do is get a multi-tool and loosen off the 2 bolts around the caliper and get that to align so that the disc is perfectly in the center of the 2 pads. You may have to do this by eye, or you may be able to apply the brake of whichever caliper you're fixing while the bolts are loosened, and then tighten them up afterwards, and that should align it. Setting up your bike can seem like real tedious maintenance, especially if you've done it once before, but it makes a massive difference to your ride and your enjoyment out on the trail. So it's worth taking the time to do, especially if you've been traveling like I have. Anyway, speaking of traveling, let's go and see these Californian trails. Yoo-hoo.